On the 13th of June 1993, in a South Minneapolis apartment, a 35-year-old woman named Jeanie Childs was found stabbed to death. The person who killed her had done so with staggering, excessive violence. She had been stabbed roughly 65 times, and much of that was inflicted after she was already dead. This was not a robbery gone wrong or a moment of panic. This was rage, and it was thorough. And then, in the days and weeks that followed, something happened that tells you a great deal about how the world assigns value to a human life. Almost nothing happened, because Jeanie Childs was a sex worker. And in 1993, the brutal murder of a woman in the sex trade did not command the attention that other murders did. As the local newspaper would later put it plainly, her death received scant news coverage. There was no public outcry, no relentless media pressure, no sense of a city demanding answers. And without that pressure, and without an obvious suspect, the case did what so many cases like it did. It slipped quietly into the cold files, and it stayed there for a quarter of a century, as if the murder of Jeanie Childs simply didn't matter very much. If cases like this one are why you're here, the ones where justice arrives decades late for a victim the world was too quick to overlook, subscribe to Decades Cold, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. This is exactly what we do here. But here is the thing the world overlooked, and the thing that would eventually undo her killer. He had left himself all over that apartment. An unknown man's DNA appeared again and again across the crime scene, on the bedding, on a towel, on a washcloth, on a shirt, in the sink, and in the middle of it, a bare human footprint, left in blood. In 1993, none of that could be turned into a name, but it was preserved. And decades later, when investigators finally ran that DNA through a genealogy database and built a family tree, it led them to a man no one would ever have suspected. A married father, a businessman, a hockey dad from a quiet town north of the city, a pillar of ordinary respectability. This is the story of Jeanie Childs, the victim the world barely noticed, the respectable man who was counting on being overlooked himself, and the science that, in the end, refused to treat either of them differently. I want to start with Jeanie herself, and I want to be careful and honest about how I do it, because this case is, at its heart, about the dignity of a person the world was too willing to reduce to a category. Jean Childs, Jeanie, to the people who loved her, was 35 years old, and the single most important fact about her, the one that this entire episode rests on, is the simplest one. She was a human being, a full one. She had a life and a history, and people who loved her. She had a mother, Betty, who loved her the way any mother loves a daughter, and who would carry the wound of Jeanie's death for the rest of her life. Years later, that mother would describe the moment she learned it was her own daughter who'd been found murdered, and she would say something that should stop anyone cold. She said she knew, in her heart, that her daughter had been crying out for her mother in her final moments, and that this, more than anything, was the thing that hurt the most. That is who Jeanie Childs was. Not a headline, not a statistic. Somebody's daughter who her mother believes called out for her as she died. Yes, Jeanie was involved in the sex trade, and I'm telling you that plainly, not because it's the most important thing about her. It isn't. But because the way the world treated that fact is central to what went wrong in this case. Because we have, as a society, a bad and persistent habit. When a victim lived a life at the margins, when they were poor, or addicted, or a sex worker, or otherwise outside the boundaries of respectability, some part of the collective response quietly decides that their death matters a little less. That they were, in some unspoken way, asking for the risk. That their murder is less of an emergency. It is one of the ugliest instincts we have, and it is wrong, morally and completely. Jeanie Childs did not deserve what happened to her 1 ounce more than anyone else. Her life was not worth less. And the fact that it took 29 years for the system to prove that, in a courtroom, is both the tragedy and, eventually, the redemption of this case. The discovery of Jeanie's murder came, grimly, almost by accident. On June 13, 1993, a neighbor in her Minneapolis apartment building noticed water seeping into his own unit. Water where there shouldn't be water. He complained about it, and when the source was traced, it led to Jeanie's apartment. Inside, her shower had been left running, which is why the water was spreading. And on the floor of that apartment, investigators found Jeanie Childs, dead. What they found was a scene of extreme violence, and I'm going to describe it only to the degree the case requires, out of respect for her. Jeanie had been stabbed an extraordinary number of times. Investigators would put it at roughly 65 stab wounds. And the medical examination established something crucial about the nature of the attack. Many of those wounds had been inflicted after she was already dead. Think about what that tells you. A person defending themselves, or a killer trying to escape, stops when the victim stops. To continue stabbing a body dozens of times after death is not about killing. It is about rage or compulsion or something even darker. The jury foreperson, decades later, would put it in blunt terms that the killer would have had to chase her through the apartment, stabbing her over and over, and that he really wanted her to die. This was a deeply personal, deeply violent act. And crucially for what came later, the killer left a great deal of himself behind. The apartment, the bedroom, the bathroom was, in the language of the investigators, covered in blood, and within that scene, the killer had deposited biological evidence in multiple places. He had left DNA. He had, we would learn, even left a bare footprint pressed into the blood. In 1993, all of that was collected and preserved. And in 1993, with no suspect and no database that could help, it named no one at all. The physical evidence of exactly who did this was sitting in that apartment. There was just no way, yet, to read it. Now we come to the part of this case that is, in some ways, the hardest, harder even than the violence, because it's about a failure that belongs to all of us, collectively, and not to any single villain. When the investigation began, detectives did what detectives do. They looked at the people closest to Jeanie. Early on, attention focused on a man in her life connected to her work, a boyfriend, described in some accounts as her pimp. But he had an alibi, and that line of investigation went nowhere. And then, without an obvious suspect, and without the forensic tools to identify the stranger whose DNA was all over the scene, the case stalled. But it didn't just stall on the evidence. It stalled on attention, and attention, in a murder case, is fuel. Public outcry, media coverage, community pressure. These things keep a case alive, keep resources flowing to it, keep detectives assigned to it, keep it from sinking to the bottom of the pile. Jeanie's case got very little of that fuel, and the reason is uncomfortable but undeniable. She was a sex worker, and the murder of a sex worker in 1993 was treated, by the machinery of public attention, as a lesser event. Her death received scant coverage. There was no groundswell. And so her case quietly went cold, and stayed cold, for decades. Not necessarily because anyone made a conscious decision to abandon Jeanie, but because a whole set of quiet, collective assumptions about whose death matters most conspired to let her slip away. This is a pattern that runs through the darkest corners of criminal justice, and it's worth naming clearly. Predators who target people at the margins, sex workers, the homeless, the addicted, runaways, understand this instinctively. They choose those victims precisely because they know society will look away. They know the outcry will be muted, the investigation less intense, the odds of getting caught lower. In other words, the same prejudice that failed Jeanie in death is often the very thing that puts people like her in danger in the first place. Her killer, whoever he was, may well have counted on exactly that a woman like Jeanie could be murdered, and the world would shrug, and he would walk away. For 25 years, he was right. Let's talk about the evidence, because the strength of the eventual case against Jeanie's killer was extraordinary, and it starts with how much of himself he left behind. When the crime scene was processed in 1993, investigators collected biological evidence from multiple locations in the apartment. And when, years later, a forensic scientist named Andrea Fea performed detailed testing on that preserved evidence, she noticed something significant. an unknown male DNA profile that did not belong to Jeanie, and that repeated itself throughout the crime scene. This is a critical distinction, so let me be precise about it. It wasn't a single stray trace in one spot, the kind of thing that could be explained away as an incidental contact. The same unknown man's DNA turned up on the comforter, on a towel, on a washcloth, on a t-shirt, and in the sink. One man, all over the scene. In the places you would expect the person who committed this bloody, prolonged attack, and then cleaned up, to leave himself. And then there was the footprint. Among the physical evidence at the scene was a bare human footprint, left in blood. Not a shoe print, a bare foot. Hold on to that detail, because it becomes the hinge of the entire prosecution years later. A bare, bloody footprint at a murder scene is an intimate piece of evidence. It means someone was standing in that apartment, without shoes, in the victim's blood. That is not the footprint of a delivery man or a prior visitor. It is the footprint of the person who was there when the blood was fresh. In 1993, this collection of evidence, the repeating DNA profile, the bloody bare footprint, pointed with total precision at one specific man and identified him not at all. There was no database that would return his name, so it all went into storage, preserved, waiting. For more than 2 decades, the complete forensic signature of Jeanie Childs' killer sat in an evidence room, fully intact, unread, while the world moved on and mostly forgot that Jeanie Childs had ever lived. The turning point came in 2015, when a Minneapolis homicide investigator, working with the FBI, decided to take a fresh look at Jeanie's case in light of how far DNA technology had advanced. This is one of those quiet, unglamorous decisions that solves cold cases. Someone chooses to pull an old file back off the shelf and ask whether the science has finally caught up. In this case, it had, or was about to. The re-examination confirmed what the evidence held: that clean, repeating, unknown male DNA profile, distributed across the crime scene, belonging to the killer. Now the investigators had a full genetic profile of the man they were looking for. But a profile, on its own, is still just a code. They ran it against the criminal databases, the standard first move, and, as in so many of our cases, it didn't return a match. The killer had never been convicted of a crime that put his DNA into the system. By that measure, he was invisible. And then something happened, outside of Minnesota, that changed everything for this case, and hundreds like it. In April of 2018, California investigators announced the arrest of the Golden State Killer using a brand new technique, forensic genetic genealogy. And law enforcement agencies across the country, watching that unfold, had the same realization at the same moment. The Hennepin County attorney would later put it simply, that they all learned quite a bit from the Golden State Killer. If you couldn't find your killer directly in a criminal database, you could find his relatives in a public genealogy database and build the family tree back down to him. The investigators working Jeanie's case took the unknown killer's DNA profile and did exactly that. They uploaded it to a genealogy database and began searching, not for the man, but for his family. The genealogical search did what it does. Jeanie's killer wasn't in the database, but relatives of his were, people who had uploaded their own DNA to explore their ancestry, with no idea they carried a genetic thread leading to a murderer. From those relatives, investigators built out the family tree, tracing the branches, narrowing the field of possible people who matched the profile and fit the facts of the case. A man who would have been an adult in Minneapolis in 1993. And the tree pointed to a name, Jerry Westrom. And when they looked at who Jerry Westrom was, the pieces fit the crime, even as they clashed completely with the life he was now living. Westrom had been in the right place at the right time. He had lived in the Twin Cities area, Minneapolis and St. Paul, during the exact window that mattered, from the early 1990s through late 1993. He had been in the city when Jeanie was killed, and there was more. Over the years, Westrom had accumulated a record of contacts with law enforcement, including offenses related to soliciting prostitution, which placed him, at least in general terms, in the world where he might have crossed paths with a woman like Jeanie. He had never once been a suspect in her murder. His name had never come up in 25 years. The family tree pulled him out of complete anonymity and set him down at the center of the case. But, and you know this refrain by now, because this channel returns to it every single time, genetic genealogy is a lead, not proof. The family tree told investigators where to point. It did not, by itself, convict anyone. To turn Jerry Westrom from a genealogical lead into a defendant, they needed his actual DNA, taken and compared directly against the killer's profile from that apartment. And they needed to get it without tipping him off, so they did the thing that has become the quiet signature of the modern cold case. They waited for him to throw something away. And here is where the case delivers its sharpest contrast, the one the whole episode is built around. Because in 2019, Jerry Westrom was not a figure lurking at the margins of society. He was the very picture of respectable, middle-class American normalcy. He was in his 50s. He was a married father. He was a businessman. He lived in Isanti, a quiet town about 40 miles north of Minneapolis. And he was, in the shorthand the local media used, a hockey dad. The kind of ordinary suburban father who spends his weekends in cold arenas watching his kid play, blending into the crowd of 1,000 other dads doing the same thing. Sit with the contrast this case sets up. On one side, Jeanie Childs, a sex worker, a woman society treated as disposable, whose murder was barely noticed. On the other, Jerry Westrom, a family man, a businessman, a hockey dad, the sort of person society extends every presumption of respectability to. And the entire injustice of this case lives in the gap between those two images. For 25 years, the world had looked past Jeanie because of who she was, and looked past Westrom because of who he appeared to be. The victim's marginal status made her murder easy to ignore. The killer's respectable status made him impossible to suspect. It was a perfect arrangement for him. This is the darker cousin of the hiding-in-plain-sight killer we've met before on this channel. Westrom didn't hide by using a fake name or fleeing across the country. He hid inside respectability itself, inside a marriage, a family, a business, a role as an ordinary suburban dad. And he was protected further by the specific dynamic of this case, the very invisibility of his victim. As long as no one cared enough about Jeanie's death to keep digging, his respectable life was never going to come under scrutiny. The two halves of the injustice held each other up. It would take a technology that has no concept of respectability and no concept of a disposable victim to knock them both down. To get Jerry Westrom's DNA without alerting him, investigators did what has closed so many of these cases. They followed him, and they waited for him to discard something of himself in public. And the setting where it happened is almost too fitting. It happened at a hockey game. In January of 2019, investigators, including an FBI special agent, tailed Westrom to a hockey game in Wisconsin, and they watched. The agent later described the moment in precise detail. Westrom sat down at a table and ate a hot dog. When he finished, he wiped his mouth. The agent specifically recalled him reaching up and wiping the left side of his mouth with a napkin. And then Westrom got up, walked over to a trash container in the lobby, dropped the used napkin in, and headed back into the arena for the second period of the game. An utterly ordinary moment. A dad at a hockey game, finishing a hot dog, throwing away his napkin. Investigators retrieved that napkin from the trash. On it was Jerry Westrom's saliva, and therefore his DNA. Once he'd abandoned it in a public trash can, it was legally theirs to collect. They sent it to the lab, and the DNA from that discarded hot dog napkin was compared against the killer's DNA profile, the profile that had repeated all over Jeanie Childs' apartment in 1993. It matched. The respectable hockey dad from Isanti was the source of the DNA that a killer had left smeared across a murder scene 25 years earlier. In February of 2019, Jerry Westrom was arrested for the murder of Jeanie Childs. After his arrest, he denied to authorities that he had ever even been in Jeanie's apartment, which set up the exact confrontation the trial would come down to. His DNA was undeniably there. He said he'd never been there. Those two things could not both be true. Jerry Westrom went to trial in Hennepin County in August of 2022, and his defense mounted the one argument that a case like this makes available, an argument that is, on its surface, uncomfortable but not unreasonable, and that trades directly on the very prejudice that had failed Jeanie for decades. The defense's argument, in essence, was this: Jeanie Childs was a sex worker. Men came to her apartment. So the presence of a man's DNA in that apartment, even a lot of it, does not prove that man is the killer. It could be explained by an entirely different kind of encounter. As one version of the defense reasoning went, she was a sex worker. There are plenty of reasons anyone's DNA could have been there. It is a cynical argument, but you can see its logic. DNA proves contact. It does not, by itself, always prove murder. And in the apartment of a sex worker, contact has an innocent explanation available that it wouldn't have in most homes. And here's where the bloody bare footprint becomes the entire case. Because a footprint left in the victim's blood is not evidence of contact at some earlier innocent time. It is evidence of presence at the moment of the killing. You cannot leave a footprint in someone's blood unless you are standing in that blood, which means you are there, barefoot, while it is fresh, in the middle of the murder scene. There is no version of a prior consensual visit that puts your bare foot into a pool of the victim's blood. When investigators analyzed that footprint, they concluded it was Westrom's, matching the ridges and patterns of his own foot. And that single piece of evidence closed the door the DNA defense had tried to leave open. The jury foreperson said it plainly afterward. What tied Westrom to the scene, what removed all doubt, was the bloody footprint in conjunction with his DNA. There was, the foreperson said, no way to explain away the footprint. The jury deliberated for about 2 hours. On that evidence, they convicted Jerry Westrom of first-degree premeditated murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. He has pursued appeals. Minnesota's Supreme Court later cleaned up a technical redundancy in his convictions, but upheld the first-degree murder conviction, and he remains behind bars. 29 years after Jeanie Childs was murdered and the world moved on, a jury looked at the evidence and decided, in 2 hours, that her killer would spend the rest of his life in prison. I chose to tell Jeanie's story because it makes a point that no amount of speeches ever could, and it makes it through pure forensic fact. For decades, Jeanie Childs was treated as a lesser victim. Her murder got scant attention. The world, in its quiet and shameful way, decided that a sex worker's death was not an emergency. And the killer, whether he consciously reasoned it or simply sensed it, was shielded by that same judgment, hiding inside a respectable life that no one thought to question, protected by a victim no one thought to fight for. The prejudice ran in both directions. It dismissed her, and it protected him. And then along came a form of science that is completely, magnificently indifferent to all of it. DNA does not know that Jeanie was a sex worker. It does not know that Jerry Westrom was a hockey dad with a business and a family. It does not weigh respectability, or assign more value to some victims than others, or extend the benefit of the doubt to people who look the part. It simply reads what is there. The killer left his genetic code across that apartment, and the science read it exactly as carefully as it would have read the code of a killer who murdered a senator or a saint. Jeanie Childs got, in the end, precisely the same relentless, rigorous forensic effort as any victim in the world, because the machinery of DNA analysis has no capacity for the prejudice that human beings brought to her case. That is the quiet moral power of this technology, and it's a side of it we don't talk about enough. We celebrate DNA for catching killers, but it does something else too. It enforces a kind of equality that human institutions have always struggled to deliver. It insists that every victim's evidence is worth reading, and every killer's code is worth matching, regardless of who anyone was. In Jeanie's case, the science corrected a moral failure that had stood for a quarter of a century. It looked at a victim the world had overlooked, and it did not overlook her. It looked at a killer the world would never have suspected, and it was not fooled. Let me leave you with the two things I most want you to carry out of Jeanie Childs' story. The first is a simple, uncomfortable challenge, and it's this: notice the instinct in yourself. When you hear that a murder victim was a sex worker or an addict or homeless or living some life at the margins, notice the small, quiet voice that wants to file that death away as less urgent, less tragic, less deserving of outrage than it would be otherwise. We all have that voice, to some degree. It's baked into the culture we swim in. Jeannie's case is a mirror held up to that instinct, because Jeanie Childs was murdered exactly as horrifically as any victim we've ever covered on this channel. Stabbed 65 times by a man consumed with rage, and her death mattered exactly as much. The 29 years it took to get her justice were 29 years too many, and a share of that delay traces directly back to that quiet voice, multiplied across a whole society. The least we can do, in her memory, is refuse to let it decide who deserves our care. And the second is about her mother. Betty carried this for decades, the murder of her daughter, unsolved, and the belief that Jeanie had cried out for her at the end. When the verdict finally came, it could not give Jeanie back, and it could not undo those 29 years of waiting, but it did something. It said, officially and permanently, in the highest voice a society has, the voice of a jury, that Jeanie Childs mattered, that her murder was not acceptable, that the world had been wrong to look away, and that it was, at last, looking straight at her. Jeanie Childs was 35 years old. She was somebody's daughter, and she deserved every ounce of the effort it finally took to find the man who killed her. He hid behind respectability, and she was dismissed for her circumstances, and DNA reversed both of those lies in a single stroke, exposing him and vindicating her. Say her name, Jeanie Childs. For a long time, hardly anyone did. Now a jury has, and so can we. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe, because the next one is already waiting.